Before screens lit up every room, there was the radio. Soft, crackling voices, familiar jingles, and stories that filled our homes with laughter, love, and sometimes a few tears. Families gathered close, leaning in, hanging on every word. It wasn't just sound, it was connection, a shared pause in a busy day, a voice in the corner that somehow knew just what you needed. Today, we're looking back at 20 British radio shows from the 1950s to the 1880s, the voices that brought families together, one magical broadcast at a time. Number 20. Children's Hour. Tales to tuck in with. For generations of British children, Children's Hour was the sound of bedtime drawing near. First launched in 1922, it continued until 1964, and for much of that time it was a daily delight, filled with stories, poems, plays and music, all designed to nourish young imaginations. It wasn't flashy, but it was filled with warmth, care and kindness. Each evening, families would gather, the little ones clutching teddy bears or blankets, to listen to tales told in gentle, loving voices. Stories from A. Milne, fairy tales, adventures, and even light educational pieces made their way into young ears. Parents appreciated its calm tone. Kids felt safe, seen, and transported. It was more than entertainment. It was part of the rhythm of family life. A comforting close to the day, like the story your mum would tell you before switching off the lamp. By the 1960s, television and changing tastes brought Children's Hour to an end. The world was moving faster, and the gentle pace of the show no longer fit the times. Still, ask anyone who listened, and their eyes will light up. Children's Hour was the magic before sleep, a soft goodbye to the day. Number 19. Saturday Night Theatre. Big drama, small fireside. Every Saturday night, while the streets outside grew quiet and the washing up was done, Saturday Night Theatre came alive. It wasn't a series, but a showcase. A full-length play every week, brought to life by some of the best voices in radio. From gripping mysteries to romantic dramas, ghost stories to historical epics, it turned ordinary homes into private theaters. The sound effects were vivid, the acting was top-notch. Listeners could close their eyes and be swept into another world, a foggy London alley, a wind-swept moor, a courtroom packed with tension. Families sat together, hushed as the story unfolded. You could feel the room lean in. It was appointment listening, the kind you planned your evening around. It made culture accessible. You didn't need a ticket, just a working radio and a little imagination. As television became more dominant, Saturday Night Theatre slowly lost its prime spot. By the 90s, its heyday had passed, but for decades it brought high drama to humble homes, proving that with the right words and the right voices, you could travel anywhere without ever leaving your chair. Number 18. The Men from the Ministry. Keeping bureaucracy silly. Sometimes the best comedy comes from taking something boring and turning it into complete nonsense. The Men from the Ministry, which aired from 1962 to 1977, did exactly that. It poked gentle fun at civil servants, two bumbling employees in a fictional government office, constantly fouling things up with the utmost politeness. Played with perfect comic timing by Richard Murdoch, and first Wilfred Hyde-White, then Derek Guyler, the characters made red tape ridiculous. Listeners loved the mild-mannered chaos, wrong files sent to the wrong departments, paperwork misplaced, decisions delayed into eternity. It was a satire that never got mean, and that's what made it charming. Families laughed not because it was outrageous, but because it was true, or at least felt like it could be. Anyone who worked in an office saw themselves in it. Anyone who didn't still understood the absurdity of the system. It wasn't a show that chased headlines or broke boundaries. It simply took everyday life and gently tipped it on its side. By the late 70s, the world had changed, and sharper satire took over. But the men from the ministry reminded us that silliness, when done right, can be very clever indeed.
Number 17. Take It From Here, The Glums We Loved. Before British sitcoms became TV staples, Take It From Here was showing everyone how it was done on the radio. Running from 1948 to 1960, the show featured various sketches, but its most beloved segment was The Glums, a comedy about a hapless young man named Ron and his endlessly patient fiancée, Eth. Each week, listeners tuned in for more of Ron's idiocy, Eth's devotion, and the sharp-tongued jabs from Mr. Glum, Ron's grumpy father. It was a portrait of working-class family life that was exaggerated, yes, but also endearing and relatable. Ron's nasal voice and Eth's sighing love became instantly iconic. Families howled with laughter as the same routines played out in new ways. It was simple, character-driven humor, the kind that made you love the people despite, or maybe because of, their flaws. Writers Frank Muir and Dennis Norden gave the show its lasting sparkle, crafting dialogue that felt both timeless and timely. When Take It From Here ended in 1960, fans felt they were saying goodbye to old friends. In an era where many shows came and went, the Glums stuck around, not just on the radio, but in people's hearts.
Number 16. The Clitheroe Kid. Little voice, big laughs. From the late 1950s through the early 1970s, the Clitheroe Kid was a staple of Sunday afternoon listening. It starred Jimmy Clitheroe, a grown man with a boyish face and a child's voice, as a mischievous schoolboy forever getting into scrapes. With his quick wit, northern charm, and sharp tongue, he teased his family, annoyed authority figures, and wriggled out of trouble with a grin. Listeners loved it. Kids laughed because he got away with things they never could. Parents laughed because they recognized the chaos, the sibling squabbles, the long-suffering mum, and the granddad with a temper. The show's rhythm, voices, and catchphrases became as familiar as family itself. Despite its slapstick tone, it had heart. Jimmy's affection for his family always shone through, even in his cheekiest moments. And while the format didn't change much, it never needed to. It worked. When Jimmy Clitheroe died unexpectedly in 1973, the show ended immediately. The country mourned, not just an entertainer, but a character who had become part of the household. For many, Sunday didn't feel quite right without the Clitheroe Kid. It left behind the echo of laughter, the best kind of legacy a boy could leave.
Number 15. I'm sorry, I'll read that again. Before the Pythons took flight. In the 1960s, before Monty Python made absurdist comedy a household name, I'm sorry, I'll read that again was already stirring the pot. A wild, musical, sketch-based show, it featured the talents of John Cleese, Graham Garden, Tim Brooke-Taylor, Bill Oddie, and Joe Candle, a soon-to-be legendary group of Oxbridge comedians. What made it stand out? Pure, unfiltered silliness. Songs about exploding custard. Sketches where logic went out the window. Catchphrases that meant nothing but still made you laugh. It was fast-paced, high energy, and perfect for teenagers and their bemused parents alike. Families would tune in, sometimes confused,
often crying with laughter. It was one of those shows where the cast's own giggles were contagious. You could hear them breaking character, corpsing mid-line, and it made the whole thing feel more alive. Though the show ended in 1973, as its stars moved on to television stardom, its legacy lingered. It bridged the gap between traditional British radio comedy and the irreverent, rule-breaking style that would soon redefine humour. For those who heard it at the time, "I'm sorry, I'll read that again" wasn't just a title, it was a promise they hoped would never stop coming true. Number 14. Just a Minute. Don't you dare hesitate. When Just a Minute launched in 1967, it sounded like chaos, but the delightful kind. The rules were simple. Speak on a subject for 60 seconds without hesitation, repetition, or deviation. In practice, it was fast, frantic, and laugh-out-loud funny. Hosted by the ever-charming Nicholas Parsons, the show welcomed a rotating cast of quick-witted panelists, most famously Kenneth Williams, whose theatrical flair lit up the microphone. Families would gather around, giggling as contestants stumbled over their words, interrupted each other, or panicked mid-sentence. Children tried to play it at home, rarely lasting more than 10 seconds before bursting into laughter. It was fun you could join in with, not just listen to. The beauty of Just a Minute was how unpredictable it was. 1 minute you'd be learning about pigeons, the next you were tangled in a rant about sandwiches. It celebrated cleverness, yes, but also silliness and spontaneity. Though the show still airs today, its heyday in the 70s and 80s felt uniquely special. It was radio that didn't take itself too seriously, proving that sometimes the simplest ideas bring the biggest smiles, especially when delivered at full speed with a twinkle in the voice. Number 13. The Navy Lark, Shipshape and Silly Fashion. From 1959 to 1977, the Navy Lark brought the high seas into living rooms, even if the ship never actually left port. Set aboard the fictional HMS Troutbridge, it followed a bumbling group of Royal Navy officers and seamen who were as likely to sink the ship as steer it. The show starred John Pertwee, Leslie Phillips, and Ronnie Barker, a trio whose comic timing was nothing short of perfect. Families loved the gentle humor, the running gags, and especially Phillips's signature catchphrase, "Left hand down a bit." It was cheeky without being crude, silly without being childish. Parents laughed at the bureaucracy being mocked, kids laughed at the voices and nonsense. Everyone could enjoy it together. In a time when many homes had a father or brother who had served, the Navy Lark struck a familiar chord. It made light of rules and ranks in a way that felt affectionate, never mean-spirited. Though it eventually bowed out as comedy moved to TV, the show left behind a fleet of fans and catchphrases that sailed on for years. It reminded us that sometimes the best way to run a tight ship is by laughing your way through it. Number 12. Listen with Mother. The sweetest sound before nap time. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Those gentle words opened the door to a world of imagination for generations of British children. Listen with Mother, which aired from 1950 to 1982, was more than just a story time show. It was a cherished daily ritual, a calm corner of the day when children could listen to nursery rhymes, songs, and softly told tales, often in the arms of someone who loved them. Mothers, and sometimes fathers too, would pause whatever they were doing to sit with little ones. The soft piano, the quiet voice of Daphne Oxenford or one of her successors, the simple stories, it all felt like a warm hug. It taught listening, it sparked imagination, and it brought a moment of stillness.
Even long after children had grown up, they remembered that phrase. It became a cultural touchstone, instantly transporting people back to a living room, a sunny window, a favorite teddy in their arms. Eventually, as schools shifted routines and broadcasting changed, Listen with Mother quietly ended. But its legacy lives on in every bedtime story, every whispered rhyme. It wasn't just a radio show, it was love, spoken softly. Number 11. My word, for the love of language. If you liked words, clever, twisted, wonderfully misused words, My Word was your kind of radio show. First airing in 1956, it was a panel game unlike any other, where contestants defined obscure words and then spun wild, funny stories based on them. What made it special were its two stars, Frank Muir and Dennis Norden. Their closing stories became legendary, often involving long, winding tales that ended with an outrageous pun. It was brainy, yes, but never stuffy. Parents loved the cleverness, kids waited for the silly twist at the end. It was the kind of show that made you feel a little smarter just for listening. And if you guessed the word before the panel did, you'd feel like a genius. The charm came from how much fun the panelists clearly had. They weren't competing, they were playing. It was like being part of an after-dinner game with witty uncles who happened to be some of the funniest men in Britain. My Word aired until the late 1980s, slowly fading from fashion as fast-paced entertainment took over. But for decades, it proved that language could be just as entertaining as slapstick, maybe even more. Number 10. Mrs. Dale's Diary. Worries, Whispers and Warmth. I'm rather worried about Jim. That simple phrase opened Mrs. Dale's diary and told listeners they were about to step into another week of quiet domestic life. First airing in 1948, it was the first major radio soap opera and ran well into the 1960s. At its heart was Mrs. Dale, the doctor's wife, narrating the goings-on of family, friends, and neighbors in soft, thoughtful tones. It wasn't sensational or dramatic. That was its charm. Listeners didn't tune in for scandal. They came for familiarity. It mirrored real life, a sick child, a neighbor's gossip, a daughter's secret hopes. It felt like eavesdropping on the family next door, one that somehow seemed a lot like your own. The gentle voice of Mrs. Dale, often worrying about her husband Jim, became a kind of national aunt, calm, loving, and relatable. Families would listen together, nodding in agreement, offering advice aloud. Eventually, Mrs. Dale's diary was renamed The Dales to modernize it, but by the late 1960s it disappeared altogether. The world had become louder and faster, but the memory of those quiet, thoughtful afternoons remained, a time when radio whispered, not shouted. Number 9. Family Favorites. Love sent across the airwaves. Every Sunday afternoon, just as the roast was finishing and the table was being cleared, Family Favorites would begin. It wasn't a comedy or drama, but something even more touching, a program that connected families across continents through music and heartfelt messages. Born during the Second World War, it continued well into the post-war decades, becoming a Sunday tradition for millions. Listeners would hear messages from loved ones serving abroad, to my darling John in Singapore, or from Mum in Blackpool to our Bill in Germany. The voices cracked sometimes, not just from the signal, but from emotion. Requests for songs followed, Vera Lynn, Bing Crosby, or a favorite from back home. For soldiers and families separated by oceans, it was a brief reunion. Hosted by the calm, kind voices of presenters like Gene Metcalf and Cliff Mitchellmore, family favorites offered comfort, continuity, and care. Even after the war ended, the show carried on, adapting as Britain's global reach changed. But by the 1980s, easier international calls and changing media tastes faded its relevance. Still, for a generation, Family Favorites was more than radio. It was a lifeline made of music, memory, and love. Number 8. Educating Archie, a dummy with a big voice. A ventriloquist's dummy on radio. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow Educating Archie became one of the most popular shows of the early 1950s. Archie Andrews, cheeky and full of attitude, was voiced by ventriloquist Peter Brough. And even though no one could see him, millions tuned in to hear Archie's banter, bad behavior, and sharp one-liners. What made it work was the writing and the young talented featured. Alongside Archie were future stars like Julie Andrews, Max Bygraves, and a young Tony Hancock. It was a breeding ground for British comedy and showbiz talent. The humor was family-friendly, with just enough sass to make kids laugh and grown-ups grin. Archie's high-pitched voice and sharp tongue became instantly recognizable. Kids bought Archie dolls, and parents marveled at how this wooden puppet had captured the nation. But by the late 50s, tastes were shifting, and the novelty wore off. Television began to steal the spotlight. Still, for a while, a puppet that no one could see made Britain laugh out loud, and that, somehow, made radio feel even more magical. Number 7. Dick Barton, Special Agent, Cloak and Dagger at Dinner Time. Before James Bond ever wore a tux, Dick Barton was already saving the day and doing it on the radio. From 1946 to 1951, Dick Barton, Special Agent, aired every weekday evening, becoming a national obsession. Families would rush to finish dinner, then huddle by the radio to catch the latest cliffhanger. It was fast-paced, thrilling, and just the right amount of mysterious. Dick, along with his loyal friends, Snowy and Jock, fought evil plots and foreign spies, often ending each episode in life-or-death peril. The theme tune, Devil's Gallop, still gives some people goosebumps. Kids imitated scenes in the garden. Parents joined in without admitting they were hooked. When the BBC abruptly ended the series in 1951, replacing it with a more sedate program, people wrote angry letters and newspapers covered the backlash. It was that beloved. Its departure marked the end of an era, when radio could still make a hero out of pure sound. Though he's mostly forgotten today, Dick Barton was once the most exciting man in Britain. And for a few years, every kitchen, lounge, and living room was his stage. Number 6. Etma. It's That Man Again. Laughter in the Hardest Times. Although it ended in 1949, It's That Man Again, affectionately called ITMA, remained part of Britain's collective memory well into the 1950s. Born during World War II, it was more than a radio show. It was a morale booster, a lifeline, a burst of laughter in the darkest years. Tommy Handley's quick wit and endless energy made people forget the bombs for half an hour. Families huddled in shelters in front rooms, hanging on to every silly sketch and catchphrase. Characters like Colonel Chinstrap and Mrs. Mop became national treasures. People quoted the show in daily life, like, "Can I do you now, sir?" became as common as "hello." For kids, it was playtime inspiration. For adults, it was emotional relief. When Handley died suddenly in 1949, the show ended instantly, and it felt like a national mourning. Still, into the 1950s, echoes of ITMA lingered. It had shaped the sound of survival, and its influence on British comedy was undeniable. Though gone from the airwaves, it lived on in hearts. Not every laugh is just about the joke. Sometimes it's about needing to laugh. ITMA gave people that gift when they needed it most. Number 5. Round the Horn. Cheeky as a wink, never over the line. From 1965 to 1968, Round the Horn made Sunday lunchtimes sparkle with laughter. It was smart, silly, and often just a bit naughty, but never enough to make Gran leave the room. Kenneth Horne, calm and composed, anchored a cast of outrageous characters, including Julian and Sandy, whose Polari slang and playful innuendo brought a hidden world gently into the mainstream. It was full of double meanings, quick wit, and satirical swipes at British society. Parents chuckled knowingly. Kids laughed just because the voices were funny. It felt like a little rebellion, but wrapped in a warm, well-spoken package. The sketches became iconic, and catchphrases made their way into everyday chat. It was clever comedy that never talked down to its audience. When Horne unexpectedly passed away in 1969, the show ended suddenly, leaving fans in stunned silence. But its legacy lived on, not just in comedy, but in culture. It opened doors, hearts, and minds, all while making people laugh around the dinner table. For many, Round the Horn wasn't just entertainment, it was a subtle revolution, slipped under the radar with a wink and a grin. Number 4. Desert Island Discs. Songs that stirred the soul. First broadcast in 1942, Desert Island Discs became a gentle Sunday ritual by the 1950s. The idea was simple. A guest would choose 8 records they'd take if stranded on a desert island. But what unfolded was something deeper, a tender conversation about life, love, loss, and the power of music. It wasn't about fame or flash, it was about memories, moments, and the songs that held them. Families often listened quietly, lost in thought. Parents would name their own desert island discs, and sometimes you'd hear your dad hum a tune you'd never known he loved. It made public figures feel human as their choices revealed their stories. A war hero picking Vera Lynn, a scientist choosing Mozart. It all felt so personal. In an age before talk shows and celebrity interviews, Desert Island Discs gave us a real connection. The host's soft voice, the scratch of a needle on vinyl, it all felt sacred somehow. Though the show still runs today, those early decades held a quiet charm. It wasn't just a program, it was a conversation across generations, one that brought people closer, not just to each other, but to themselves. Number 3. The Goon Show. Utter nonsense, and all the better for it. There was nothing quite like The Goon Show. When it began in 1951, it took everything people thought they knew about comedy and blew it to bits, literally, with sound effects, absurd voices, and explosions of nonsense. Spike Milligan's wild imagination, Peter Sellers' unmatched voices, and Harry Seacombe's musical charm made for a chaotic masterpiece. It wasn't a tidy sketch show, it was an anarchic, beautifully silly world. Families would crowd around the radio, kids lying on the carpet trying to make sense of Blue Bottle, Eccles, and Neddy Seagoon. Half the time you didn't understand what was going on, and that was the point. It was a show that celebrated imagination over logic. It made people laugh in new ways, and often laugh without knowing why. Wartime seriousness still lingered in Britain during the early 50s, and The Goon Show was like letting the country breathe out all at once. When it ended in 1960, it left behind a generation of comedy lovers who'd never look at a joke the same way again. It was weird, wild and loud, and it made the quiet living room feel like the liveliest place in the world. Number 2, Hancock's Half Hour, Tea, Toast and Tony Hancock. When Hancock's Half Hour hit the airwaves in 1954, it felt like comedy had come home. Tony Hancock, with his deadpan delivery and long-suffering sighs, played a fictional version of himself, a man always just one step behind success. Written by the legendary duo Galton and Simpson, the show took everyday situations, a visit to the doctor, a trip to the railway station, and made them hilariously tragic. Families across Britain would gather on Sunday evenings, cups of tea in hand, chuckling as Hancock declared himself the lad himself. His character was self-important, yet hopelessly unlucky, a reflection of post-war Britain's uncertain charm. The supporting cast, including Sid James and Kenneth Williams, brought energy and contrast, but it was Hancock's timing and tone that made it gold. As television took over, Hancock's Half Hour made the leap to the small screen, but fans never forgot its radio roots. The intimacy of hearing his voice in your living room had a warmth that no television ever quite matched. It wasn't just funny, it was clever, comforting, and oddly relatable. For many, it was the first time radio comedy felt personal, and that made it unforgettable. Number 1, The Archers. A pint at the Bull and a chat about the crops. In 1951, The Archers came on air as a simple farming program meant to help post-war Britain with agricultural advice. But it quickly became something else entirely, a window into rural life and a regular meeting point for millions of listeners. Set in the fictional village of Ambridge, it followed the daily triumphs and troubles of farmers, vets, teachers, and pub-goers. Families would listen together after tea, nodding along or gasping at a surprise plot twist. It felt close, not flashy or dramatic, just like real life. Grace Archer's tragic death in a fire in 1955 was one of the most listened-to radio events in British history. People cried, sent flowers, and wrote in, devastated by the loss of someone they considered a friend. It was proof of just how real these characters felt. The show still airs today, but many fans say the early decades had something special, something quieter and more familiar. For those growing up in homes where radios ruled the evening, The Archers was a shared experience, comfort, companionship, and conversation, all wrapped into 15 minutes. It didn't just tell a story, it became part of ours. Looking back at these unforgettable radio shows from the 1950s through the 80s, it's clear that they were far more than background noise. They were the heartbeat of family life. Each program carried its own rhythm, the soothing calm of Listen with Mother, the laughter of The Goon Show, the suspense of Dick Barton, or the warmth of The Archers. Together they shaped evenings, connected generations, and turned ordinary living rooms into spaces of shared imagination. Long before streaming, podcasts, or endless television channels, families would gather around a single device and find joy in the same voices, the same jokes, the same songs. These shows didn't just entertain, they built memories, strengthened bonds, and offered comfort in uncertain times. Though their era has passed, their echoes remain, reminding us that the true magic of radio was not just in what we heard, but in how it brought us together.